as a result of World War One. But we did get involved in 1917. The other thing that's I need to mention is that Russia was an ally, but in 1917, the same year we got involved, Russia had a revolution at home. And what happened in 1917 is that they had a communist revolution. Up until that point, they had been led by the Tsar, which I think we've talked about was basically a king. The name Tsar, Tzar or Tsar, comes from the Latin word Caesar. So these guys saw themselves as sort of emperors or kings. The czars of Russia had ruled for a long time, and there was a communist revolution. And I don't know if we've talked about communism, but let me just say that very briefly that communists were atheists, and they also believed that the government should own all property. That basically there should be no private property. And so in 1917, the Russians had a huge revolution. They killed the Tsar and his family, and they took over the country. And as a result of that civil war, they pulled out of the war. They were not involved in the rest of World War I. And they become a communist country. They were led by a guy named Lenin, it's Lenin. He was the first communist leader of Russia. And so Russia pulls out, but the United States gets involved, as well as some other countries. And eventually the United States won. Now, I want to talk about the end of the war, though, because this is what's so important. The tragedy of World War I is that it did not prevent World War II. Most people now agree that though the fighting had stopped, the causes of World War I, namely various forms of nationalism, and the causes of World War I were still there, and we sort of made it worse at the end of World War I. So the Allies won, but in the Treaty of Versailles, which was the treaty that basically made all the agreements about what should happen after the war, it did several things, but in particular I want to point out what it did to Germany. They basically said, okay, Germany, you have to take all the blame for the war. You have to totally demilitarize. That means get rid of you have to reduce your army, and you have to reduce your weapons. And you have to pay everybody else for the war and its damages. Now, most people look back on this and agree that was a big mistake. The war wasn't really all Germany's fault, although they were a major aggressor. And Germany could not pay. I mean, think about it. If you've fought a war and you've lost, do you have money to repay? So the Treaty of Versailles had the effect of making Germans very bitter and creating a very terrible situation in post-war Germany. And contrast this, after World War II, when we beat Germany and Japan, the United States spent millions and millions of dollars rebuilding those countries, not making those countries repay, because we learned a lesson after World War II that we basically just created, and it made it just a perfect situation. Hitler could come along and say, guys, we are suffering, and it's the fault of all these countries that beat us in World War I, and we're gonna do something about it. One last thing. At the end of World War I, all of the old sort of royal governments around Europe were gone. So remember, I said in Russia they were led by the Tsar, which was an emperor. In the Ottoman Empire, they had a king, as it were. In various other countries in Europe, there had been old traditional monarchies. Well, after World War I, those were all gone, and they were replaced with modern sort of Western democratic countries, but they did not work very well. Many of the borders that we now have in the world, like Iraq, Syria, in fact, almost all of the Middle East, Turkey, the Balkan Peninsula, all of those borders were sort of set after World War I, and they weren't necessarily set that well. But the biggest thing I want to point out is that the atheism, the Extreme nationalism that made a religion out of one's country was still in place after World War I. And that's why ultimately World War II came in only a generation after that. Okay, I hope this was helpful. I hope it wasn't too far over your heads, and we'll see you guys next week.